Tape Deck Media.
Hey Ruddle Maniacs and Ruddaholics out there. I've got an interesting little bonus episode for you today. You've probably heard me allude to this in the podcast previously, but for those who hadn't heard about it, I recorded an audiobook. That's right, I recorded Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. And it was recorded for the Plains FM show called Spin Me a Tale, which airs every Saturday at 9:30 in the morning. It goes for about half an hour until 10 o'clock, and it plays about 2 chapters of the current audiobook that they are playing. I think the one that just wrapped up before mine was The Secret Garden, and as of the time of this releasing, I think there are 2 or 3 editions of Treasure Island Spin Me a Tale on their podcast player, which I'll chuck into the description below. But the reason for this bonus podcast today is because I've actually been very graciously given permission by Pia from Plains FM to play for you the first chapter of Spin Me a Tale right here on Ruddle Me This. So you can listen to it here first, and if you decide you like it, I'll chuck some links in the description to find out where you can catch up on the rest of the story. So first of all, just a big thank you to Plains FM for letting me actually do the audiobook. It was a fantastic experience. It was a lot of work, but I really enjoyed it. And I got to meet pretty much all the team members, which has been very, very rewarding. So with that, I'm going to play the first episode now. I think it's chapters 1 and 2 of the actual book. And then I might talk about my thoughts on the book as well as what it was like recording the audiobook afterwards. So stick around afterwards and you'll be able to hear me talk for a little bit longer about it. One other thing I forgot to mention while I was recording this, because I'm a little bit all over the place this week, was that I actually was able to read Treasure Island because of a project called Project Gutenberg. Now, I've actually read books on Project Gutenberg before, and in case you don't know what it is, Project Gutenberg is an online library of free ebooks. Project Gutenberg was the first provider of free electronic books, or ebooks. Michael Hart, founder of Project Gutenberg, invented ebooks in 1971, and his memory continues to inspire the creation of ebooks and related content today. So they are pretty effing major. From what I've heard, it's all voluntary, and it's basically just people wanting to spread books to the digital platform. They've got all sorts of ones you can read for free. I can't remember what I've read. I think I read a little bit of, I think it was like Frankenstein or Dracula or something on there. But yes, I read Treasure Island off Project Gutenberg. So I'm going to chuck a link in the description, and I highly recommend you check them out because it's a fantastic resource. So with that, let's weigh anchor and set sail for chapters 1 and 2 of Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson.
This program was first broadcast on Canterbury's access media station, Plains FM, and was made with the assistance of New Zealand On Air.
Spin Me a Tale presents Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, read by Taylor Ruddle.
Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. Narrated by Taylor Ruddle. Part 1. The Old Buccaneer. Chapter 1. The Old Sea Dog at the Admiral Benbow. Squire Trelawney, Dr. Livesey, and the rest of these gentlemen, having asked me to write down the whole particulars about Treasure Island from the beginning to the end, keeping nothing back but the bearings of the island, and that only because there is still treasure not yet lifted. I take up my pen in the year of grace 17, and go back to the time when my father kept the Admiral Benbow Inn, and the brown old seaman with the sabre cut first took up his lodging under our roof. I remember him as if it were yesterday, as he came plodding to the inn door, his sea chest following behind him in a hand-barrow, a tall, strong, heavy, nut-brown man, his tarry pigtail falling over the shoulder of his soiled blue coat, his hands ragged and scarred with black, broken nails, and the sabre cut across one cheek, a dirty, livid white. I remember him looking round the cove and whistling to himself as he did so, and then breaking out in that old sea song that he sang so often afterwards. 15 men on the dead man's chest, Yo ho ho and a bottle of rum, in the high, old, tottering voice that seemed to have been tuned and broken at the capstan bars. Then he rapped on the door with a bit of stick like a handspike that he carried, and when my father appeared, called roughly for a glass of rum. This, when it was brought to him, he drank slowly, like a connoisseur, lingering on the taste, and still looking about him at the cliffs and up at our signboard. "This is a handy cove," says he at length, "and a pleasant sitiated grog shop. Much company, mate?" My father told him no, very little company. The more was the pity. "Well then," said he, "this is the berth for me. Here you, matey," he cried to the man who trundled up the barrow. "Bring up alongside and help up my chest. I'll stay here a bit," he continued. "I'm a plain man. Rum and bacon and eggs is what I want, and that head up there for to watch ships off. What you mought call me?" "You mought call me Captain." "Oh, I see what you're at there." And he threw down 3 or 4 gold pieces on the threshold. "You can tell me when I've worked through that," says he, looking fierce as a commander. And indeed, bad as his clothes were, and coarsely as he spoke, he had none of the appearance of a man who sailed before the mast, but seemed like a mate or a skipper accustomed to be obeyed or to strike. The man who came with the barrow told us that the mail had set him down the morning before at the Royal George, that he had inquired what inns were along the coast, and hearing ours well spoken of, I suppose, and described as lonely, had chosen it from the others for his place of residence, and that was all we could learn of our guest. He was a very silent man by custom. All day he hung round the cove or upon the cliffs with a brass telescope. All evening he sat in a corner of the parlour, next the fire, and drank rum and water very strong. Mostly he would not speak when spoken to, only look up sudden and fierce, and blow through his nose like a foghorn, and we and the people who came about our house soon learned to let him be. Every day when he came back from his stroll, he would ask if any seafaring men had gone by along the road. At first we thought it was the want of company of his own kind that made him ask this question, but at last we began to see he was desirous to avoid them. When a seaman did put up at the Admiral Benbow, as now and then some did, making by the coast road for Bristol, he would look in at him through the curtained door before he entered the parlour, and he was always sure to be as silent as a mouse when any such was present. For me, at least, there was no secret about the matter, for I was, in a way, a sharer in his alarms. He had taken me aside one day and promised me a silver 4-penny on the 1st of every month if I would only keep my weather eye open for a seafaring man with one leg, and let him know the moment he appeared. Often enough, when the 1st of the month came round and I applied to him for my wage, he would only blow through his nose at me and stare me down. But before the week was out, he was sure to think better of it, bring me my 4-penny piece, and repeat his orders to look out for the seafaring man with one leg. How that personage haunted my dreams, I need scarcely tell you. On stormy nights, when the wind shook the 4 corners of the house, and the surf roared along the cove and up the cliffs, I would see him in 1,000 forms, and with 1,000 diabolical expressions. Now the leg would be cut off at the knee, now at the hip. Now he was a monstrous kind of a creature who had never been but the one leg, and that in the middle of his body. To see him leap and run and pursue me over hedge and ditch was the worst of my nightmares. And altogether, I paid pretty dear for my monthly 4-penny piece in the shape of these abominable fancies. But though I was so terrified by the idea of the seafaring man with one leg, I was far less afraid of the captain himself than anybody else who knew him. There were nights when he took a deal more rum and water than his head would carry, and then he would sometimes sit and sing his wicked, old, wild sea songs, minding nobody, but sometimes he would call for glasses round and force all the trembling company to listen to his stories or bear a chorus to his singing. Often I have heard the house shaking with yo ho ho and a bottle of rum, all the neighbours joining in for dear life, with the fear of death upon them, and each singing louder than the other to avoid remark. For in these fits he was the most overriding companion ever known. He would slap his hand on the table for silence all round. He would fly up in a passion of anger at a question, or sometimes because none was put, and so he judged the company was not following his story. Nor would he allow anyone to leave the inn till he had drunk himself sleepy and reeled off to bed. His stories were what frightened people worst of all. Dreadful stories they were, about hanging and walking the plank, and storms at sea, and the dry Tortugas, and wild deeds in places on the Spanish Main. By his own account, he must have lived his life among some of the wickedest men that God ever allowed upon the sea, and the language in which he told these stories shocked our plain country people almost as much as the crimes that he described. My father was always saying the inn would be ruined, for people would soon cease coming there to be tyrannized over and put down, and sent shivering to their beds. But I really believe his presence did us good. People were frightened at the time, but on looking back, they rather quite liked it. It was a fine excitement in a quiet country life, and there was even a party of the younger men who pretended to admire him, calling him a true sea dog and a real old salt and such like names, and saying that there was the sort of man that made England terrible at sea. In one way, indeed, he bade fair to ruin us, and he kept on staying for week after week, and the last month after month, so that all the money had been long exhausted, and still my father never plucked up the heart to insist on having more. If ever he mentioned it, the captain blew through his nose so loudly that you might say he roared, and stared my poor father out of the room. I have seen him wringing his hands after such a rebuff, and I am sure the annoyance and terror he lived in must have greatly hastened his early and unhappy death. All the time he lived with us, the captain made no change whatever in his dress, but to buy some stockings from a hawker. One of the cocks of his hat having fallen down, he let it hang from that day forth, though it was a great annoyance when it blew. I remember the appearance of his coat, which he patched himself upstairs in his room, and which, before the end, was nothing but patches. He never wrote or received a letter, and he never spoke with any but the neighbours, and with these, for the most part, only when drunk on rum. The great sea chest, none of us had ever seen open. He was only once crossed, and that was towards the end, when my poor father was far gone in a decline that took him off. Dr. Livesey came late one afternoon to see the patient, only took a bit of dinner from my mother, and went into the parlour to smoke a pipe until his horse should come down from the hamlet. For we had no stabling at the old Benbow. I followed him in, and I remember observing the contrast, the neat, bright doctor with his powder as white as snow, and his bright black eyes and pleasant manners, made with the coltish country folk, and above all with that filthy, heavy-blared scarecrow of a pirate of ours, sitting far gone in rum, with his arms on the table. Suddenly he, the captain that is, began to pipe up his eternal song. 15 men on the dead man's chest, yo ho ho, and a bottle of rum. Drink, and the devil had done for the rest. Yo ho ho, and a bottle of rum. At first I had supposed the dead man's chest to be that identical big box of his upstairs in the front room, and the thought had been mingled in my nightmares with that of the one-legged seafaring man. But by this time we had all long ceased to pay any particular note to the song. It was new that night to nobody but Dr. Livesey, and on him I observed it did not produce an agreeable effect, for he looked up for a moment quite angrily before he went on with his talk to old Taylor, the gardener, on a new cure for the rheumatics. In the meantime, the captain gradually brightened up at his own music, and at last flapped his hand upon the table before him in a way we all knew to mean silence. The voices stopped at once, all but Dr. Livesey's. He went on as before, speaking clear and kind, and drawing briskly at his pipe between every word or two. The captain glared at him for a while, flapped his hand again, glared still harder, and at last broke out with a villainous low oath. "Silence there between decks." "Were you addressing me, sir?" says the doctor. And when the ruffian had told him with another oath that this was so, "I have only one thing to say to you, sir," replies the doctor, "that if you keep on drinking rum, the world will soon be quit of a very dirty scoundrel." The old fellow's fury was awful. He sprang to his feet, drew and opened a sailor's clasp knife, and balancing it open on the palm of his hand, threatened to pin the doctor to the wall. The doctor never so much as moved. He spoke to him as before, over his shoulder and in the same tone of voice, rather high so that all the room might hear, but perfectly calm and steady. "If you do not put that knife this instant in your pocket, I promise upon my honour, you shall hang next to the assizes." Then followed a battle of looks between them, but the captain soon knuckled under, put up his weapon, and resumed his seat, grumbling like a beaten dog. "And now, sir," continued the doctor, "since I now know there's such a fellow in my district, you may count I'll have an eye upon you day and night. I'm not a doctor only, I'm a magistrate, and if I catch a breath of complaint against you, if it's only for a piece of incivility like tonight's, I'll take effectual means to have you hunted down and routed out of this. Let that suffice." Soon after, Dr. Livesey's horse came to the door and he rode away, but the captain held his peace that evening and for many evenings to come. Chapter 2. Black Dog Appears and Disappears. It was not very long after this that there occurred the first of the mysterious events that rid us, at last, of the captain, though not, as you will see, of his affairs. It was a bitter, cold winter, with long, hard frosts and heavy gales. And it was plain from the first that my poor father was little likely to see the spring. He sank daily, and my mother and I had all the inn upon our hands, and were kept busy enough without paying much regard to our unpleasant guest. It was one January morning, very early, a pinching, frosty morning, the cove all grey with hoarfrost, the ripple lapping softly on the stones, the sun still low and only touching the hilltops and shining far to seaward. The captain had risen earlier than usual and set out down the beach, his cutlass swinging under the broad skirts of the old blue coat, his brass telescope under his arm, his hat tilted back upon his head. I remember his breath hanging like smoke in his wake as he strode off, and the last sound I heard of him as he turned the big rock was a loud snort of indignation, as though his mind was still running upon Dr. Livesey. Well, Mother was upstairs with Father, and I was laying on the breakfast table against the captain's return when the parlour door opened and a man stepped in on whom I had never set my eyes before. He was a pale, tallowy creature, wanting 2 fingers on the left hand, and though he wore a cutlass, he did not look like much of a fighter. I had always my eye open for seafaring men, with 1 leg or 2, and I remember this one puzzled me. He was not sailorly, and yet he had a smack of the sea about him too. I asked him what was for his service, and he said he would take rum, but as I was going out of the room to fetch it, he sat down upon my table and motioned me to draw near. I paused where I was with my napkin in my hand. "Come here, sonny," says he. "Come nearer here." I took a step nearer. "Is this here table for my mate Bill?" he asked with a kind of leer. I told him I did not know his mate Bill, and this was for a person who stayed in our house, whom we called the captain. "Well," said he, "my mate Bill would be called the captain, as like as not. He has a cut on 1 cheek, and a mighty pleasant way with him, particularly in drink, has my mate Bill. We'll put it, for argument like, that your captain has a cut on 1 cheek, and we'll put it, for, if you like, that cheek's the right one. Ah, well, I told you. Now, is my mate Bill in this here house?" I told him he was out walking. "Which way, sonny? Which way is he gone?" And when I had pointed out the rock and told him how the captain was likely to return, and how soon, he answered a few other questions. "Ah," said he, "this'll be as good as drink to my mate Bill." The expression on his face as he said those words was not at all pleasant, and I had my own reasons for thinking that the stranger was mistaken, even supposing he meant what he said. But it was no affair of mine, I thought, and besides, it was difficult to know what to do. The stranger kept hanging about just inside the inn door, peering round the corner like a cat waiting for a mouse. Once I stepped out myself into the road, but he immediately called me back, as I did not obey quick enough for his fancy. A most horrible change came over his tallowy face, and he ordered me in with an oath that made me jump. As soon as I was back again, he returned to his former manner, half fawning, half sneering, patted me on the shoulder, told me I was a good boy, and that he had taken quite a fancy to me. "I have a son of my own," said he, "as like you as 2 blocks, and he's all the pride of my art. But the great thing for boys is discipline, sonny, discipline. Now, if you had sailed along of Bill, you wouldn't have stood there to be spoke to twice, not you." That was never Bill's way, nor the way of sich as sailed with him. And here, sure enough, is my mate Bill, with a spyglass under his arm. Bless his old art, to be sure. "You and me'll just have to go back into the parlour, sonny, and get behind the door, and we'll give Bill a little surprise. Bless his art, I say again." So saying, the stranger backed along with me into the parlour and put me behind him in the corner so that we were both hidden by the open door. I was very uneasy and alarmed, as you may fancy, and it rather added to my fears to observe that the stranger was certainly frightened himself. He cleared the hilt of his cutlass and loosened the blade in the sheath, and all the time we were waiting there he kept swallowing as if he felt what we used to call a lump in the throat. At last in strode the captain, slammed the door behind him without looking to the right or left, and marched straight across the room to where his breakfast awaited him. "Bill," said the stranger in a voice that I thought he had tried to make bold and big. The captain spun round on his heel and fronted us. All the brown had gone out of his face, and even his nose was blue. He had the look of a man who sees a ghost, or the evil one, or something worse, if anything can be, and upon my word, I felt sorry to see him all in a moment turn so old and sick. "Come, Bill, you know me. You know an old shipmate, Bill, surely?" said the stranger. The captain made a sort of gasp. "Black dog," said he. "And who else?" returned the other, getting more at his ease. "Black dog as ever was, come for to see his old shipmate Billy at the Admiral Benbow Inn. Ah, Bill. We have seen a sight of times, us two, since I lost them 2 talons," holding up his mutilated hand. Now look here," said the captain. You've run me down. Here I am. Well then, speak up. What is it?" "That's you, Bill," returned Black Dog. "You're right in the front of it, Billy. I'll have a glass of rum from this dear child here, as I've took such a liking to, and we'll sit down, if you please, and talk square, like old shipmates." When I returned with the rum, they were already seated on either side of the captain's breakfast table, Black Dog next to the door, and sitting sideways, so as if to have one eye on his old shipmate and one, as I thought, on his retreat. He bade me go, and leave the door wide open. "None of your keyholes for me, sonny," he said, and I left them together and retired into the bar. For a long time, though I certainly did my best to listen, I could hear nothing but a low gattling, but at last the voices began to grow higher, and I could pick up a word or two, mostly oaths from the captain. "No, and an end of it," he cried once, and again. "If it comes to swinging, swing all, say I." Then all of a sudden there was a tremendous explosion of oaths and other noises. The chair and table went over in a lump, a clash of steel followed, and then a cry of pain, and the next instant I saw Black Dog in full flight, and the captain hotly pursuing, both with drawn cutlasses, and the former streaming blood from the left shoulder. Just at the door the captain aimed at the fugitive one last tremendous cut, which would certainly have split him to the chine had it not been intercepted by our big signboard of Admiral Benbow. You may see the notch on the lower side of the frame to this day. That blow was the last of the battle. Once out upon the road, Black Dog, in spite of his wound, showed a wonderful clean pair of heels and disappeared over the edge of the hill in half a minute. The captain, for his part, stood staring at the signboard like a bewildered man. Then he passed his hand over his eyes several times, and at last turned back into the house. "Jim," he says, "rum," and as he spoke, he reeled a little and caught himself with one hand against the wall. "Are you hurt?" cried I. "Rum," he repeated. "I must get away from here. Rum. I ran to fetch it, but I was quite unsteadied by all that had fallen out, and I broke one glass and fouled the tap. And while I was still getting in my own way, I heard a loud fall in the parlour, and running in, beheld the captain lying full length upon the floor. At the same instant, my mother, alarmed by the cries and fighting, came running downstairs to help me. Between us we raised his head. He was breathing very loud and hard, but his eyes were closed and his face a horrible colour. "Dear, dearie me," cried my mother. "What a disgrace upon the house, and your poor father sick." In the meantime, we had no idea what to do to help the captain, nor any other thought but that he had got his death hurt in the scuffle with the stranger. I got the rum, to be sure, and tried to put it down his throat, but his teeth were tightly shut and his jaws as strong as iron. It was a happy relief for us when the door opened and Dr. Livesey came in on his visit to my father. "Oh, doctor," we cried, "what shall we do? Where is he wounded?" "Wounded? A fiddlestick's end," said the doctor. "No more wounded than you or I. This man has had a stroke, as I warned him. Now, Mrs. Hawkins, just you run upstairs to your husband and tell him, if possible, nothing about it. For my part, I must do my best to save this fellow's trebly worthless life. Jim, you get me a basin." When I got back with the basin, the doctor had already ripped up the captain's sleeve and exposed his great sinewy arm. It was tattooed in several places. Here's luck, a fair wind, and Billy Bones, his fancy, were very neatly and clearly executed on the forearm. And up near the shoulder there was a sketch of a gallows and a man hanging from it, done, as I thought, with great spirit. Prophetic," said the doctor, touching this picture with his finger. "And now, Master Billy Bones, if that be your name, we'll have a look at the colour of your blood. Jim," he said, "are you afraid of blood?" "No, sir," said I. "Well then," said he, "you hold the basin," and with that he took his lancet and opened a vein. A great deal of blood was taken before the captain opened his eyes and looked mistily about him. First he recognised the doctor with an unmistakable frown, and then his glance fell upon me, and he looked relieved. But suddenly his colour changed, and he tried to raise himself, crying, "Where's Black Dog?" "There is no black dog here," said the doctor, "except what you have on your own back. You have been drinking rum. You have had a stroke, precisely as I told you, and I have just, very much against my own will, dragged you head foremost out of the grave. Now, Mr. Bones—" "That's not my name," he interrupted. "Much I care," returned the doctor. "It's the name of a buccaneer of my acquaintance, and I call you by it for the sake of shortness, and what I have to say to you is this. One glass of rum won't kill you, but if you take one, you'll take another, and I stake my wig, if you don't break off short, you'll die. Do you understand that? Die. And go to your own place, like the man in the Bible. Come, now make an effort. I'll help you to your bed for once." Between us, with much trouble, we managed to hoist him upstairs and laid him on his bed, where his head fell back on the pillow, as if he were almost fainting. "Now, mind you," said the doctor, "I clear my conscience. The name of rum for you is death." And with that he went off to see my father, taking me with him by the arm. "This is nothing," he said as soon as he had closed the door. "I have drawn blood enough to keep him quiet a while. He should lie for a week where he is. That is the best thing for him, and you. But another stroke would settle him."
You've been listening to Spin Me a Tale. That was Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, read by Taylor Ruddle. For more Spin Me a Tale episodes, you can follow us on Spotify, iTunes, or the Plains FM website, plainsfm.org.nz.
And we're back. I hope you enjoyed that. I can promise you that my narration does get better over time as I get more comfortable on the microphone and then actually eventually transition to being able to record them at home, which was a huge help in productivity as well as just confidence and comfortability on the mic. Oh, before I start talking about the book, I should put a spoilers notice in. I'm going to be talking about elements from the book. So if you haven't read the books or you want to experience it like week to week as they go on, don't listen to this bit. Come back when you've finished it and listen again. But as for right now, ye be warned, spoilers ahead. And you may later that. So once again, if you want to hear the rest of those, you can tune in at 9:30 on Saturdays on Plains FM 96.9. Or you can always follow the link in the description box to check out it. It's been like archived online, which you can listen to as far as whatever the latest episode is. So now I'm going to talk about a little bit about my experience of recording this audiobook and my thoughts on Treasure Island itself and just in general the whole experience. So it's very safe to say that when I agreed to do this project, I severely underestimated how long it was going to take. I'm pretty sure I started recording in October of 2023. Might have been November, but that's roughly when the process kind of got underway. And I'd always had it in my head that the Treasure Island was a little kid's book, like almost like a picture book. And when I was given the list of books that I could record, I thought, Treasure Island, that'll be great. I could get that done in an afternoon. And then about towards the end of my first recording, when I think I'd just gotten 3 or 4 chapters done in about 2 hours, I looked at how long the book was and saw it was 34 chapters, and I was like, oh dear, I may have made a mistake here. But I'm very happy to say that we actually got through it in the end, and I managed to see the project through to its end, which is a rare thing for me. One thing that helped a lot was being able to record at home again. Initially, I was going into the Plains FM studio, which the studio is awesome and all the technology is great in there, but I live like kind of on the edge of town, and so it was a little bit tricky to get into town during the day. And then when you record in the studio, you kind of have a block of about 2 hours. And if I was having a really, really good day and I wasn't making a lot of mistakes, I could get about 4 chapters done in that 2 hours. And then you add maybe like half an hour to an hour either side of that to get home and back, got to pay for parking in the city, that kind of thing. It was all starting to add up quite a lot. So I was absolutely delighted when I asked Pia if I could record them from home and did a couple of test recordings. The audio quality was fine. And so that made it so much easier because then I could just figure out a gap that I had in my week. Think, okay, I've got this morning and this morning and this morning free. I can just bang out a couple of chapters each morning. And I must have ripped through the second half of the book in like a month or so. I think the whole process from start to finish was about 5 months, although I did have some gaps in between because I just couldn't find a minute to get into the studio. The weirdest thing that I've learnt about doing audiobooks as well, and this is something that I've done a little bit of research on, is that actually 2 hours is about the most that anybody can do while still delivering an acceptable quality of the audiobook, if that makes sense. And it was fascinating because I'd start recording at 11 o'clock. The first chapter, I'd get that done immediately. No mistakes, no having to go back and re-record stuff, kind of all just in one go. And that was about 30 minutes. And then the second one would go by pretty uneventfully as well. So now it's, 12 o'clock? First 2 chapters in the bag, I'm feeling good. And then the third chapter was when I started to hit the wall. And it's a bizarre feeling. It's like, I think it's more of a concentration thing than a tiredness thing, if that makes sense. Because by about the third chapter was when I would start to make a lot of mistakes, and my mouth would get clumsy, and I would start to like fumble on sentences, or if it was a long sentence, I wouldn't be able to get through the whole thing, like without attempting it a couple of times. And then the fourth chapter, forget about it. That would be my absolute low point in terms of concentration and energy levels. So the smart thing would have been to stop at 3, but sometimes when I only had these 2 hours, I would push myself to get through the fourth. So if I was going to there would be a lesson from this. If I was going to do an audiobook in the future, I'm going to limit myself to just doing a couple of chapters a day to keep the quality as high as possible. And this 2-hour thing was actually sort of confirmed to me by a couple of audiobook narrators that I quite enjoy. It's Michael Kramer and Kate Redding. If you've ever listened to any of Brandon Sanderson's works or the Wheel of Time audiobooks, they're kind of like the gold standard of audiobook narration. And I wanted to see how I stack up compared to them. So I looked up some videos online, and they've actually got some quite detailed videos of them recording in their studio and what their setup looks like. And I felt very validated and very seen when Michael said the most you can get out of one day is about 2 hours because your concentration starts to go. And I was like, that's exactly what I've been experiencing. He said your concentration will go long before your voice goes, which if you've been listening to this podcast, you'll know that I'm always complaining about trying to preserve my voice as much as possible. So I've been looking up all sorts of remedies and such, and a friend of mine actually just suggested that one thing that can help inflammation a little bit is gargling salt water. So I've been trying that out for the last couple of days just to see if it helps me at all. Helps me sort of retain my voice for as long as possible. I also felt very seen watching those documentaries and seeing that they had a packet of vocal zone, I don't know if you'd call them lozenges, but vocal zones on the desk, which I think are pretty good for keeping your throat and your vocal cords healthy. So like I said, it felt really validating to learn that even those two have been doing it for 20 years. They can still only do about 2 hours in a session. So I felt like I was, perhaps not in quality of voice acting, but, I bring a lot of hustle to the court, as they might say. I suppose speaking of voices, that's one thing. If I were to sort of critique my performance, that would be, actually, we can make this a teachable moment. So if you're in the position of having to do an audiobook coming up, I definitely recommend that you read the source material in advance. I say this because I kind of wanted to just experience Treasure Island, I guess at the same time as the listener. I just wanted to read it for the first time as I was recording it, which was not the wisest move, because what happened was there were certain characters that I did not realize were going to be as prominent as they were in the end, like the Dr. Livesey, or Dr. Livesey, I think is how it's correctly supposed to be pronounced. This will be another thing we'll talk about, is character name pronunciations. But I thought Dr. Livesey was going to be in it for the first couple of chapters, not realizing that he was going to be a main character. So had I read ahead and known that, as well as certain other characters like the captain, James Smollett, I pronounce his name Smollett in the audiobook, but then I watched the movie and they called him James Smollett. So I suppose my advice here would be don't do what I did and actually familiarize yourself with the material. Because I didn't realize these characters were going to be around for so much. I thought the story was mainly about Jim and Long John. So what I would have done was I would have come up with characters for voices for each of these characters. And I guess in a sense you do this a little bit. Like I tend to go a little bit higher when I was doing Jim's voice, because I knew Jim as a young kid essentially. And I used to put a little bit of a nasal tone on my voice when I was doing the voice of the Doctor. Kind of like that. It did fall off towards the end, because halfway through this I watched the movie and I realised the Doctor wasn't he wasn't this Weasley character like I'd been picturing in my head. He's actually a former soldier or something. So the voice like this didn't really suit him by the end of the book. And this is the voice I was doing when I was performing as Jim Hawkins, sir, of the Benbow Admiral Inn. Admiral Benbow Inn. Jesus. We're going off the rails a little bit here. And then I think I would just try to go a little bit deeper with Captain Smollett. See, I can't even get it right this time. Captain Smollett was kind of how I'd do his voice. And again, my range isn't great. I've never been an actor or anything really, so it was all kind of learning on the fly. The big thing that I probably would have redone if I was going to do it again is I probably would have watched the movie earlier and then kind of at least attempted to do a version of John Silver's voice from the movie. I can't remember what year it's from. I think it's in the 90s, but it's got Christian Bale as Jim Hawkins, which was great. And like the thing that I learnt about just pirate culture, because I'm a big fan of pirates. I loved the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. SpongeBob is weirdly influenced by a lot of pirate culture. Watched that a lot growing up. Treasure Planet, which was just basically a remake of Treasure Island but in space. Rogue Galaxy is a PS2 game I'm replaying at the moment. That's a space pirates thing. Pirates are deep into Western culture, I tell you. One Piece, big fan of One Piece. That's all pirates. And what I didn't realize is how much of modern, or I guess fictional pirate culture was influenced by this book, Treasure Island. Like the biggest thing that I would say is the portrayal of John Silver in that particular Treasure Island. I'll chuck a link in the description to which one it is, so you can check it out if you want to. But so, like, the way John Silver talks in that is the classic pirate, like, "Arr, shiver me timbers," that sort of, I think Mr. Krabs talked like that in in SpongeBob, Barbossa in Pirates of the Caribbean. Here there be monsters. That kind of, I have no idea where it's from, and apparently it wasn't particularly any one accent. It was sort of a blend of a few accents that the actor did. And there were certain catchphrases that Silver has that I wasn't really aware of until like 3/4 of the way through the book when I realised he kept saying them. But he would always say, "And you may lay to that." And in the Kiwi accent, that doesn't sound great, but when he say it in the pirate accent, "And you may lay to that," something about it just sounds a little bit nicer. He would also say, "By thunder," which, by thunder, in the New Zealand accent is a bit weird. Oh, they call each other lubbers all the time. Ya lubber. So, like, if you've heard any of those characters speak, probably they were basing it on this portrayal of Long John Silver from the 90s Treasure Island adaptation. A few other things about Silver, the character of Long John Silver, which even if you don't really know the book, you've probably heard of Long John Silver. For years, I wondered why they called him Long John. Apparently, it's literally just because he's tall. Like, his name's just John Silver, but the nickname of Long John, this is his nickname. Another nickname that I wasn't aware that John Silver had is all of the ship crewmates call him Barbecue because he pretends to be the chef or the cook, I guess is probably the more accurate one. And so all the pirates call him Barbecue, which feels like such a weirdly modern word to me. And it felt so out of place seeing the word barbecue in this very, very old book. John Silver's got the parrot on his shoulder that screeches the phrase "pieces of 8." And actually the parrot is named Captain Flint as a kind of disrespectful thing to his previous captain, Captain Flint. Much like how Barbossa names his monkey Jack after Jack Sparrow in Pirates of the Caribbean. The whole, like, treasure map, X marks the spot kind of thing, I think, comes from Treasure Island, as does the phrase "the black spot," which was kind of explained in the book. It essentially just seems to be like a thing from the pirate code that the captain receives when his crewmates are dissatisfied with him and they want to, like, depose him or get rid of him. So yeah, there's just heaps of pirate culture has been influenced by this book. And I tell you what, it's actually not as hard of a read as I thought it was going to be. I should have looked this up beforehand, but I found Lord of the Rings a much harder read because of all the complicated language that it uses. Whereas the language in Treasure Island is quite straightforward. I was also quite surprised when I was picking books, the staff at Plains FM warned me that I might need to tweak certain slang words or perhaps slurs just based on the time that these books were published in. And I was quite surprised I didn't have to cut any racial slurs out of the book, although I did have to change. I just cut out a few references to. It wasn't a racial slur, but it was a racial thing that I thought, we don't really need. There's no reason for that to be in the book. It doesn't add to the plot in any way. So I just tweaked bits and pieces of it like that. It was only a couple of times I had to tweak things. So it's actually aged, fairly well. And I think it's still worth the read. Especially if you're into pirates, you can kind of see the origin point for a lot of the culture that we're seeing today. I think the next thing that I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to properly watch Black Sails, because Black Sails is a prequel kind of series where they combine real pirates plus a lot of the characters from Treasure Island and sort of show the lead up to how they all ended up where they are at the start of Treasure Island. But I'm going to have to finish making my way through Succession and Peaky Blinders before I do that, I think. I'm like 2 episodes off of finishing Succession, and I think we're only 1 season into Peaky Blinders, so I've got a wee while to go before I get back into Black Sails. What's kind of interesting about the one thing I noticed, it's sort of tied to a bigger conversation of how morality has changed in the current world, like especially in 2024. We're going through a bit of a phase where like colonialism is almost considered like a dirty word. People people use it in a very, very negative connotation. And it's very interesting to read Treasure Island, which is from a long, long time ago, and think about the way the characters talk about like duty and honor and things like that. Because I'll give you a spoiler: one of the main characters passes away at some point, and so the guys in the crew, they cover his body with the Union Jack, and they raise a flag, so, as best they can on an island. They raise a flag to half-mast, and this was seen as a tremendously honourable thing. That whole British, like, stiff upper lip for queen and country kind of, whatever it was probably king and country back then. And the characters often talk about, oh, my pride as an Englishman, or like, they put race as a very, there seems to be an expectation that Englishmen will conduct themselves as sort of gentlemen around the world, and those sneaky Spaniards, and there's this weird kind of there's this weird racism that's very different to the kind of racism that you see today. And to the characters, the idea that their ship has been or could be taken over by pirates, and the Union Jack gets taken down and replaced with a black Jolly Roger pirates flag, is like unthinkable. They can't imagine something worse happening than that. And so it's just it's interesting to notice how times change, and how things that back then, which would have been considered very honourable and very English and all that kind of thing, we kind of look back on and sort of we think, don't know if we'd agree with some of the values that the characters hold back then. I guess just quickly I'd like to talk about the Treasure Planet movie, which is a remake of Treasure Island. And some things they changed that I think might have been for the better. Because if you're not familiar with the book, or the general story of it, is Jim Hawkins and his mother own the Admiral Benbow Inn. The father, Jim's father and his mum's husband passes away very early into the book. So they're just left to sort of fend for themselves. And Billy Bones, who's one of Captain Flint's crew and John Silver's former crewmate, he turns up kind of looking to hide from the rest of his crew, as somehow he got his hands on Flint's treasure map, and the rest of the crew obviously want to kill him for this. And then so, violence ensues at the start. They get found by the pirates, and then who is it? It's Jim, it's the Doctor, it's Captain Smollett, and it's a couple of other sort of minor characters all end up going to Treasure Island alongside these treacherous pirates. And the movie is the Treasure Planet changes a few things, because one of the underlying stories of Treasure Island is that Long John Silver kind of takes Jim under his wing, and Jim it's the classic story of the absent father figure getting replaced by a new mentor that, we've seen this in so many films and novels and everything. And I really didn't see much. I couldn't see much development in between Jim and John Silver in the books. But again, this might come down to the values being different, because there's a few lines where Silver, talks about, "Oh, Jim, you're a good lad. I like you, and you're a clever lad," and all this kind of thing. But I don't really know why Jim was so fond of him in the beginning. Maybe it's just because his father's recently passed away, so he's looking for a new kind of role model to latch onto. But one thing I think that Treasure Planet did well is they really built up the relationship between Jim and John Silver. Like, shows John Silver actually teaching him things and giving him life lessons and everything like that. And to be fair, the John Silver in that movie, he's a lot more of a Shades of Grey sort of character than the John Silver in the book, who I think is pretty bad, pretty evil, if you will. Something else that was interesting that the movie did is it cut down on the number of characters, so it seems like they've combined 2 or 3 characters into the Doctor character, which is a shame, because Dr. Livesey, the way he is in Treasure Island, was one of my favourite characters. He's sort of this dashing, heroic, he's a former soldier, and he's a doctor, and he's a magistrate, and he's not afraid of the pirates, and he's, again, another sort of surrogate father figure for Jim. maybe that's kind of now that I'm thinking about it, maybe that's kind of that's one of the moral things that the book is playing about, is Jim's got the Doctor, and then he's got John Silver as kind of the angel and the devil on his shoulder, and it's sort of about which path does Jim want to follow going forward. But in the movie, they changed the Doctor quite a lot. They sort of combined a character called the Squire Trelawney, I think he's called. They combined the Squire and the Doctor into one character, and they sort of combined aspects of them both. Like the Doctor, obviously, is a doctor. He's very well read and educated, but then the Squire is a blabbermouth. He can't keep his mouth shut about the treasure map, and so they sort of, it feels like they transposed a lot of the worst aspects of both characters and then made it into this character. I can't remember what he's called. He's Dr. something. I don't think it's Dr. Livesey. But I suppose they did it so that the character can start off as meek and feeble and not very likable, only then to grow into a hero by the end of the movie. So I think maybe that's why they did it. But I was very sad not to see a sort of one-to-one transposition of Dr. Livesey into this Space Pirates movie. Well, that's about my thoughts on the process of recording the audiobook, and just what my thoughts on the on the medium. Once again, make sure you tune in to Plains FM 96.9 every Saturday at 9:30 to listen to the following chapters of that book. I won't be uploading the rest of them here. I only got permission to do the first one. Or you can always visit the link in the description below, where I'll put a link there so you can listen to it online. And it's about a couple of chapters every week, so it's going to be airing for the next 15 weeks or so. So you can basically tune in at any time and check it out. Well, anyway, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this bonus episode. And before I forget, don't forget to come and listen to me ramble on like this in a stand-up comedy sense, as I'm going to be doing the Nelson and the Dunedin Fringe Festival in the latter half of March. On the 14th and 15th of March at 9 o'clock at Studio One in Nelson, I've got my show Panic at the Buffet. Tickets for that you can find on nelsonfringe.co.nz, and then the following week, the 20th through to the 23rd, from 7 o'clock till 8 o'clock at Inch Bar in Dunedin, doing the same show, Panic at the Buffet in Dunedin. Again, tickets from dunedinfringe.co.nz, or just check out my Facebook page to find out. They'll have the links and stuff on there. Thanks for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. I'll talk to you again very soon.
This has been a Tape Deck Media production. Thank you for listening.